Boo Bridges was one of the first Black children to desegregate schools back in the 60s. Her legacy continues to fight for equal rights and desegregation of schools still today, 70 years later, when it is the most needed. Racial segregation has risen in levels from the start of desegregation until now. This is caused by the hardship that students of color still face compared to the challenges white students face. Due to lack of education, resources, and other amenities, students of color are less likely to succeed or graduate high school than white students. There were and are still many people who fight for desegregation, some who have a closer view than others. The efforts that were put to end segregation did work for some time, but slowly lost their power. Racial segregation can still be seen today despite the many efforts civil rights groups and the government have done to prevent it because systematic racism causes inequality. Systematic racism is causing more inequality today than it did before the civil rights movement. At the start of post-civil rights movement, racial segregation was not as noticeable as it is now. The population of students of color in schools has increased immensely since the late 1980s. In schools today, 9 out of 10 students are those of color. However, a study done by the Civil Rights Project found that students of color in the South are less likely to attend majority white schools than they were post-civil rights movement. In fact, the percentage of Black to white students has dropped from 44% in the late 80s to about 23% in 2011. The reason behind the new rise of segregation is still the problem of having unequal opportunities. Most schools that have a majority of students of color have more financial and social issues than schools of majority white. Segregation often brought many negative effects towards the Black community. Before the civil rights movement, only 1 out of 10 Black students would graduate high school compared to the 4 out of 10 white students. This comparison was most likely caused by the fact that schools serving colored students never had enough resources and had too many students to serve. The effect of segregation for the Black community itself was having poor neighborhoods. Poverty-stricken communities often had less healthy food stores and more greasy fast food stores. These neighborhoods were also more likely to be exposed to pollution and violent crimes. Those living in Black communities had limited opportunities for doctors, causing them to die of heart problems and other cancers. Many people played a factor in desegregating schools, the government, and people on the front line. Civil rights groups and activists had parts in desegregating schools. Some of them include the students themselves. A November civics project discussing the ideal school environment sparked a student-led protest. The students confronted their local school board about obvious inequality going on in the schools, all without adult help. The school board ignored them. John Dudley recollects, so that week leading to Monday, we strategized, and we had everybody on board, 720 students. We told them not to tell your parents or your teacher what's going on. And do you believe to this day, 2013, nobody has ever told me that an adult knew what was going on? Kids. On the day of the marching protest, a secret code was said during the announcements to let the kids know it was time. For about a week, this protest went on until Atkin High School was renovated 18 months later. Despite this, the school remained segregated until the 70s. Lawrence Jenkins was the first African-American student to attend Bogalusa Junior High School in 1967 and was a plaintiff of the desegregation suit, Jenkins versus Bogalusa School Board. Lawrence had one foot in 2 different worlds, stating that he caught a lot of slack, like from the Black community, because they used to say, oh, you think you're something because you're going to a white school. They didn't know I was catching holy heck at the white school. I had no friends, so it was just always a conflict. Despite the school continuing to have separate proms until recently, Jacob quotes, "But it was hard. But you know what? If I had to do it all over again, I would do it exactly the same way because it was the cause that was well worth the outcome, even though I feel like people in Bogalusa are still not accepting as they could be." His mother, Gail Jenkins, however, continued to serve for the Bogalusa School Board for 27 years. The government played a huge role in the desegregation of schools, most notably the NAACP and the Brown versus Board case. Oliver Brown was the lead plaintiff of 5 different class action lawsuits of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. He started to get involved on behalf of Black school children and families in Delaware, South Carolina, Kansas, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. when his daughter, Linda, was not allowed to attend an all-white elementary school. The best moment for the NAACP was the Supreme Court's decision for the Brown versus Board case. As the court declared school segregation as unconstitutional, the Plessy versus Ferguson case decision, separate but equal, was then abrogated. Those fighting desegregation never had it easy as they fought for their rights. The Board of Supervisors of Prince Edward County, one of the 5 class action suits in Brown versus Board case, refused to give funds to the county school board. They decided to shut down public schools for 5 years instead of integrating them. Due to the chaos and confusion desegregation caused, Congress asked Southerners to use any lawful means to resist this. This action would be called Southern Manifesto and was brought on by the court's decision in Brown versus Board. Many Southern Blacks decided to boycott the Jim Crow laws after the verdict of Brown versus Board. However, since the verdict also gave rights to white Southerners to oppose desegregation, the famous battle of a high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, 1957, soon followed after. Many Northerners, along with others, were outraged by this violence, speeding up the workings of the civil rights and voting rights to about the mid-60s. At the first, the idea of school segregation was executed very well, but as the years went on, the fight and care for it slowly disappeared. Now the original problem of inequality is making its way back to the spotlight. The court's decision in Brown versus Board did not fix segregation as America had hoped. Many believe that social and political forces in the nation have made the most difference in ending segregation. This makes the 60-year-old verdict an even more complicated situation. Due to many neighborhoods still being segregated, the force of school segregation to be strong even today. The Fair Housing Act 1968, along with other judicial decisions that made racial discrimination illegal, was made to end exclusionary economic zoning laws. However, many working class Americans and lower income families often have limited access to better schools based on where they live. Richard Rothstein in 2014 did an Economic Policy Institute report to mark the 60th anniversary of the verdict of the Brown case. He reports that the amount of Black students attending mostly white schools went down from 36% to about 29% then, 1980. Civil rights groups, along with the government, try their best to end racial segregation. But the inequality can still be seen today through systematic racism. Racial segregation is still on a noticeable level today due to systematic racism and the inequality it brings. Many schools that have a higher African American population often have half the resources students need to thrive in their education. Efforts are once again being made to end segregation and fight for everyone, not just people of color. The fight for equal rights for children and the desegregation of school is still continuing today, 70 years after the first Black child Ruby Bridges took the first steps of becoming a legacy.